At some point, we will get through his point. So we're working our way through it, though. So chapter 9 starts off talking about all the regulations and rules that were in place for the first covenant. And he talks about those so he can establish them as he applies them to Christ at the end of this chapter and through chapter 10. So we've gone through here. It talks about all the things that are included in the rules and the preparations that go into using those things. And we covered the atonement sacrifice and the unintentional sins versus the high-handed sins, which he talks about here in verse 7. And then last week we added Numbers 19, the Red Heifer ceremony and the Red Heifer cleansing from contamination by death. Somebody dies, everything around it is corrupted. Everything around it becomes unclean. And until it's cleansed, those involved can't be involved in the sacrifices to remove sin, to cover sin. Verse 13, whoever touches a dead person, the body of anyone who has died and does not cleanse himself, defies the tabernacle of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from Israel, because the water for impurity was not thrown on him. He shall be unclean. If you are ever contaminated and never cleansed, you are outside the camp. You are outside of Israel. So this had to take place. And I didn't put these up last week, but we did kind of talk about death being the symbol for how sin completely excludes you from God. So in the garden, Eve said, quoting what God had said in the previous chapter, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, neither shall you touch it, else you will die. And then so when that takes place, that separation is created. And just like Paul said, the wages of sin is death. So death and sin are symbolically connected. And that's why this particular cleansing with the red heifer sacrifice is used with so much weight here in Hebrews. So the process, just to recount the process, you have to have a red heifer without any defects. It has to be completely red, in which there is no blemish, and on which a yoke has never come. So it has never been used for breeding or anything. It's taken outside the camp and slaughtered. Some of the blood is sprinkled 7 times back toward the front of the tent of the meeting. So back toward the tabernacle, but you're outside the camp. So you are throwing it in the direction of the tabernacle. And then you take its skin, flesh, blood, dung, all the stuff that you would normally have burned, plus the stuff that you would normally have eaten. The whole thing shall be burned. And then you toss in cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet yarn as 3 more symbols. Then you take some of the ashes and fresh, meaning living water, moving water, clean water, and you mix it together and you sprinkle that on the unclean person and the unclean things on the 3rd and 7th day. The 3rd symbolically meaning the beginning of the sanctification, and the 7th meaning the completion of the sanctification. Washing his clothes and bathing himself in water. So you do that after you have been cleansed with the sprinkling. And then at evening, you shall be clean. So that's the whole process that you have to go through for this cleansing. And ultimately, as he just talked about in verse 7, if the man who is unclean does not cleanse himself, that person shall be cut off from the middle of the assembly, since he has defiled the sanctuary of the Lord, because the water for impurity has not been thrown on him, he is unclean. If you are separated and you don't do this, you remain separated from the camp, the tabernacle. And because you're separated from the tabernacle, that means you're separated from God, because that's where God is. That's how this all symbolically works. And then I went and grabbed something off the internet just to exemplify what I talked about with the fact that a lot of evangelicals, which we are evangelicals, but I hope we're not this radical about our evangelicalism, are out there trying to find red heifers to sacrifice because we can't let God come back until we have red heifers. We have to do something for him to help him so he can come back. So we're out trying to find red heifers to do this sacrifice so that then they can then have a temple that they will rebuild on the Temple Mount that they can offer sacrifices in, because everybody has been corrupted by death. And until we do this again, we can't have any sacrifices in the temple. And there's one particular guy who's named Stinson who has gone, he actually went out all across the United States and found 5 of these things and flew them to Israel. And they're stored in Israel right now, just waiting for the moment that we can. And they practiced one time. That's what this is. They practiced one time just to make sure they had everything they needed and they could do it right. So they got a rabbi who went through all the stuff and then did this as a practice run. So that's the extent that people kind of go through. And this, I think there's a little more impact with this as we would get kind of further into here in Hebrews, because I think it's kind of interesting that Hebrews goes out of its way to talk about how the blood of goats and bulls, etc., ashes of a heifer, can't clean you. And yet God can't come back until we have the sacrifice. It's kind of contradictory. So let's go through these next few verses. We've got a whole lot of things in here I wanted to kind of detail. So right after that, he talks about, but when Christ appeared as a high priest, or the high priest, of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Now, if we were all fluent speakers of Koine Greek and lived in the 1st century, we wouldn't have to do what we're about to do. But really, there is so much packed into this that when you go through translation, you kind of lose, that I want to walk back through this. I always talk about how translation is also interpretation. So there's a lot of interpretation here based on what we have built our theology around that really wasn't there when he wrote it. Which is not to say it's wrong, but I want you to kind of understand the framework here. So, first of all, Christ appeared as the high priest, a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, not Israel. And he is the high priest, as this says, of the good things that have come, but really, because of the tense there, it's that have become. So these good things have become, but it's also not what it really says, because this being in the aorist tense, in the complete verbal tense that it's in, roughly says that Christ appeared as high priest of the good things coming, which, if you think about it very literally in English, if this is what it said in English, these are the good things coming, that does not nail it down at all for you about where it is in time. It could mean that they are currently coming, continually coming, or coming in the future. And that's kind of how the aorist tense works. It doesn't tell you specifically what's going on. So here, this kind of leaves open the question of when the good things arrive. Are they here, or will they not? Will they all come in the future, or are they starting to come now and they will continue to come till in the future? On top of all that, because of the word orders, which you don't get in English here, but the original word order, it doesn't really tell us what is coming. Because the way we got it here in English, we take it that the good things are what's coming. But what it could say is that Christ, as the high priest, coming through the greater and more perfect tent. So it could be referring to Christ coming through the tent. So it's describing his process of doing the sacrifice, not the good things. He would be the high priest of good things coming through the tent. All of that is ambiguous. It depends on how you want to read it as to what it says. So we read it in English, it seems all pretty solid, but it's gone through a translation process that has kind of interpreted it for us. There's a lot of that in this section. Look at there at the end of that second line of this verse. It says, Christ appeared as high priest of good things coming, then through the greater and more perfect tent. Now, we've been talking about this word, all the words around the Greek telos, which we continually translate as perfect. But think about that phrase right there. It is a more perfect tent. Do you see the irony in that? If something is perfect, how are you going to make it more perfect? So this just illustrates what we've been talking about all along. That word doesn't mean perfect. It means getting something finished at the end the right way. So the whole idea here is that it is a process, not that it is done. And so the tent is approaching completion. It's better than the tent that was before it. It's successive to that tent. And it was better than that tent. But it's not a perfect tent made more perfect. It was never perfect to begin with. It's a completion of a process. So that is just a good illustration of how that word perfect being used for this Greek word doesn't really convey the right ideas. The perfect tent not made with hands, that is not of this creation. And that Greek word that is translated more perfect is one Greek word, teleoteros there. I'll put that there just so I could remember it myself. So it's neither through the blood of goats and calves. Now the blood of goats, and when he says through the blood of goats and calves, what's he referring to? There he's referring to where we looked at in Leviticus 16, which is the atonement cleansing. Then he goes on, but through his own blood did enter once into the holy places, eternal redemption having obtained. So he hasn't gotten to the ashes yet. So he's talking about Leviticus 16 here. I want to call attention to this phrase here where he says eternal redemption having obtained. To us, that is saying that Jesus, through his own blood, went into the holy place, offered this sacrifice, and because of that offering, eternal redemption was obtained for all of us. There's this issue with the verb tense again coming into play here. What it literally says is that eternal redemption himself found. So this word that's translated having obtained here means to find something. It's not as strong, and this gets to the same idea with this word perfect. It's the same kind of situation. It doesn't mean that he was out looking for it and just stumbled on it and found it, but it literally does mean that. That's what it literally means. That someone is searching for something and they find it. What we have going on here, this verb is in the middle voice, which means nothing to y'all. Because in English, we got tired of the middle voice and we threw it away completely. We have remnants of it in our language, but we generally just don't have it at all. We have two voices in our language. We have an active voice and a passive voice. And so in Koine Greek, there's a third one in the middle between the two, a middle voice. The active voice means the verb is referring to something you do. So as an example, I washed. When we say I washed, what does that imply? We washed ourselves. I washed me. The passive voice flips the verb around. So when you say something in the passive voice in English, you generally will put the word to be, is, or was in there between the verb and the subject. So it would go from I washed to I was washed, because the action of the verb is happening to the subject, not the subject doing that. You see the difference? So that's active and passive. Well, if that's not complicated enough for you, Koine Greek has a middle voice, which strengthens the fact of the activity, in essence. So it would become I myself washed, which is still a little ambiguous, but it means that the washing is happening to yourself and that you were involved in it, which is why we quit using it in English, because when you say I washed, why do you need I washed myself? Because everybody understands that that means you washed yourself. So we kind of threw the middle voice away. But it's still there in Koine Greek. And it kind of works a little differently than what all that implies. But it means that the subject is participating in whatever's happening. Jesus himself entered in once into the holy place, and eternal redemption himself found. He was involved in it, which some translator notes that I read say that it meant that he was the only one that could do it. He himself, the only one being the person capable of finding this eternal redemption. But if you throw all that interpretation out, what it literally says is that is what you see here. He entered into the holy place and himself found eternal redemption. What does that tell you specifically? Nothing. From the perspective of that could mean that he found eternal redemption for all of us. Or it could mean that he found eternal redemption for himself. Or it could mean that he found eternal redemption for himself and all of us. It doesn't really say what it means because it's in that middle voice. It just means he participated in whatever was going on, either the sacrifice or the result of the sacrifice. Now, because of what the writer of the book of Hebrews has talked about repeatedly, getting us to this point where Jesus had to suffer to be perfected, teleotes, he has implied that Jesus went through a process to become Christ, to become perfected. And so that's maybe what he's getting at here as well, that the sacrifice applied not only to us, but to him too. Now, we're on the other side of the interpretation. So our theology says that he didn't need to be redeemed. And so the redemption fell only on us. And the language that's used here can mean that. So it's left up to you to decide how the writer meant it. And regardless of how the writer meant it, how did God mean it? All that's left to you. But the translators don't leave it up to you. The translators tell you what it means. So this is a good example of what a translator has to go through when they come on something like this. Do I try to literally translate it and let the people reading it try to figure out what it means to them? Or do I explain it to them, even though it really doesn't explain it to them? That's what translators end up doing. If I'm understanding all of this correctly, not being a speaker of Koine Greek in the first century, this would probably be the same position that a reader in the first century would have encountered. They would have had to decide which way he meant it. And then the other question that asks, from my perspective, is, did he mean to leave it ambiguous like this? Or did he mean to be specific, but he just didn't get it quite as specific as he meant it? I just use this as an example for you to understand the gap between where we are now and where this was written. There's a whole lot in that gap. When we get to chapter 11, this all goes away. But all those question marks, I want all those question marks to be there because they're important. Verse 13, for if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer, so we have chapter 16 of Leviticus, and now we're at 15 of Numbers. Both of those things. Sanctify for the purification of the flesh, all of that done for the ceremony of the red heifer in Numbers 19 was only for the sanctification of the flesh. It cleaned you enough to get you to the atonement again, to get you to the sin offering. There's a path there you're going through. So it's sanctified for the purification of the flesh. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? That word living there is the same word that you have for living water. It's just the word zoe. It's the Greek word zoe, which means alive. It's what we are. Here it's applied to God just to contrast him between the living God and all the dead gods, the unreal gods. He says that this blood of Christ was applied in this process through the eternal Spirit. Jesus offered himself through the eternal Spirit. And I'm not sure what he means by that, because you can take it in a lot of different ways. It indicates that the Spirit was part of this process in some way. But was the Spirit part of the process with Christ, with Jesus, when he was here on the earth? And that because the Spirit was with Jesus on the earth, it helped Jesus get to the point where he could be in a condition that his blood would work for the sacrifice. The implications with all that meaning that Jesus was purified through his life, through the Spirit. So that's a whole lot of theology that it doesn't say, but some people take it that way. The idea that we generally have here is that the Spirit was just part of the ceremony, part of the sacrifice. The Spirit had to be present for the sacrifice to work, which would imply that the Spirit was also present in the Holy of Holies when the sacrifices were occurring in the Old Testament. That was God's Spirit, the Spirit of God, which that could be very simply all he's talking about here. It's just that's a phrase there that he uses that really is left unexplained. What it does do is put the Trinity in one verse, which doesn't happen a lot, but it is there in this verse. You've got Christ and the eternal Spirit, the Holy Spirit, and the living God. So clearly the three elements were present here in Hebrews as well. So he offered himself without blemish to God, and what that does is purify our conscience. Now, all the translations that I've seen translate it purify or purifying our conscience. And I wish they hadn't used that word, because to me, there's a much better word they could have used, which, because of the subject matter, is the word that I think they should use here. Because what do we keep talking about with the sacrifices in the Old Testament? What did they do? Purify is not the word we talk about. It's cleanse. They wash away. They're cleaning you. That's what all of that discussion, when we talked about the Red Heifer ceremony, even after the stuff is sprinkled on you, what do you have to do? You have to take a bath. To me, if it said cleanse our conscience, it would stay with the theme of sacrifice and still convey the right idea. So I'm telling you that just so you can read that word in there and it'll make sense with the application of the sacrifices. It cleanses our conscience. It does to our conscience what the Red Heifer ceremony did to the unclean person. It takes all that sin and washes it away. And it's the same thing the goat did in the atonement process. You put all the sins on the living goat and you let him haul them off. So they didn't disappear. They ran off with the goat. And they didn't disappear with the washing of the red heifer. You just get them off of you. You're cleansed of them. That imagery becomes more important as we progress through here. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to do that. And then what else it does here is it cleanses our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. This idea of from dead works. I'll refer you back to stuff we've already talked about in chapter 5 and chapter 6 and what we're going to be talking about in chapter 10. That's why I point this out, because go back up to verse 7 in this chapter where he talks about the unintentional sin. God used the atonement and the sin offering to cleanse the whole nation from their sins, but all of those sins were unintentional sins because all those who committed intentional sins weren't there anymore. It's conditional to that, in essence. You had to be in the group to get the sacrifice to work for you. And you're cleansed from dead works implies, and I think chapter 5 and 6, at the end of chapter 5, he talked about them not being capable of understanding everything he was going to tell them. And then in chapter 6, he talks about how if you become unsaved, you can't be resaved. And this follows that same idea, and we're going to run into that again in the next chapter. That if you are in the group, you aren't covered if you put yourself outside the group again. Just like the intentional and unintentional sins did. If you take yourself out of the group, you're out of the group. What this means in that sense, what I'm saying here is that you're purified, your conscience is purified from dead works, and you don't do them anymore. Which is not typically the way we approach this, because for us, we continue to be sinners. This implies that you don't continue to be sinners. That you stop being a sinner if you're cleansed, and if you go back to being a sinner, you're out of the camp. Now, Paul talks about in Romans and some other places how we continue to be sinner. But it's still we, it's not you. So in other words, you can sin, and he talks himself about how he doesn't always do what he wants to do. Sometimes he does what he doesn't want to do. So we have some contrast here that we have to resolve. So we'll work our way through this as we continue to go through this. It becomes more pointed in chapter 10, so that's where I want to deal with it. To serve the living God. Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from transgressions committed under the first covenant. So a death had to occur. For where a will is involved, the death of one who made it must be established. For a will only takes effect at death. So he's talking about the kind of will that you leave. So the promise that God gave, the covenant that God gave to our inheritance, how do you get an inheritance? Somebody has to leave it in the will and then die. It's the only way you can get an inheritance. So that's what he's talking about here. For where a will is involved, the death of one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Who made the will? Who made this promise in the Old Testament? God the Father. So if God made the promise, who had to die? God had to die. Otherwise, the will won't work. That's the only way you can interpret this, because and what I find ironic here is the big argument that happened a century and a half after this we talked about earlier with the Patripassionists, who argued continually that God can't die, and that if you make Jesus God, you're killing God. You can't kill God. God can't die. And yet right here, we don't get anything unless God dies. So I don't know how they dealt with that. Again, this is the realm of theology. But for the will to take effect, God has to die. Otherwise, it won't work. So I'll leave that with you, and we'll pick it up there.